Well, Psalm 15, no need for a big review. Just the idea is that David is drawing a character profile. These he is writing about behaviors that are motivated by values and beliefs. That's the way it works, right? All of our behaviors come from our values and beliefs. I, you probably already figured that out, but last time we talked about the fact that this, I'm going to call it the righteous person. I don't mean the person who's always right. I mean the person who is living as best they can according to God's design for life. That person, we left off last time, he cast no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear the Lord. All my talk about role models and all of that. And then he goes on, and who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind. The King James Version, I learned years ago, is who keeps his oath and repenteth not. Meaning, when you give your word, you're good for it. In my adult life, there have been a number of times when a deal or an agreement has been sealed with a simple handshake. But the older I've gotten, the fewer of those I've had in my career life. I don't know, my first ministry, I had a summer youth ministry, which would today have been called a summer internship, but we didn't know anything about internships back then in 1972. Anyway, I never signed a document. They just hired me. My first ministry, never signed a contract. Moved to Tulsa. I don't remember ever signing a contract. I think it was our word, but from then on, it's been contracts, and I understand that. The world simply doesn't support people keeping their word. I wish it did. And I've heard people talk about, boy, back in the day, you didn't have to worry about that. Well, I suppose that's true. I think people have always been, though, prone to tell you one thing and do another, to give you their word and then not come through with what they had promised. This is not just them people, the bad people out there. It happens with Christians as well. When you give your word, that's really the essence of making an oath, is keeping your word. You have made you've made a promise. Now, in the Old Testament, there are several kinds of oaths that one could take. Many of them had to do with oaths made to God. These were promises made to God, specific acts of worship, sacrifice, behavior. But there were oaths that were made between parties as well. Okay. I don't know. I think David was talking about both kinds, but it was not just the oath that one would make to God. This was the oaths that we make with one another. Who keeps an oath even when it hurts. Think about that. If our culture would recapture the value of this and the practice of it, for me, it feels like that would revolutionize life. We don't have there's no lack of oath making. It's just a lack of oath keeping. In the 90s, a legitimate and godly movement began. Coach McCarthy at the university, at Colorado University, started Promise Keepers. And he founded the whole movement around the urging men, and instructing men, urging them to be godly fathers, husbands, men, and instructing them in some specifics of what that meant and what that looked like. Huge stadiums full of men from all across the country gathered in Boulder at the beginning of the movement, and then it spread. There were gatherings of 60, 70, 100,000 men all across the country at various stadium venues. It was a lot of rah-rah and chest pounding, and it started by a coach. It had kind of the stadium feel and theme, but it was for real. I don't know how many, would probably be impossible to find out, how many homes were changed and families were set on a path to a greater destiny because of what Promise Keepers did and promoted and supported. I was blessed to be a part of that. I had nothing to do with the organization, but participated, took guys, went to 10 different ones, and it was inspiring. One of the things I discovered, though, which, shouldn't have taken me that long to figure it out, but there's a lot of promise makers, but not so many promise keepers. Our world, the world you live in, the world I live in, I'm talking about our local worlds. I don't think we need any more promise makers, but we've got to have promise keepers. David understood this. He was inspired by God, so he should have, but he did understand it. This person, male or female, they keep an oath even when it hurts. It's not hard to keep an oath when it's simple. It's hard when it hurts. Because when the pressure's on, when it becomes, it starts out probably as it gets inconvenient, and then it might get expensive, and then it might become very difficult and even hurtful. Well, David's talking about the kind of person that doesn't back down from the oath because it was inconvenient or uncomfortable or expensive or even hurtful. When that happens, what does a promise keeper do? For most of my experience, when it gets hard like that, I was just told, try harder. Just try harder. Reach deeper, try harder. Well, there's no question that is going to be required in those difficult times, but that's not enough. And I can testify from my own life. It's not been enough for me. I don't think it'll be enough for you either. And part of the reason, the biggest part of the reason, is all of our human effort, all of our try-harders have limits. And sometimes the challenge is greater than my limits. It just comes down to that. In that situation, me trying harder, it won't fix it. Okay? It's not going to change the situation. I know it sounds like a Sunday school answer, but we got to have God at work in our lives, and we've got to follow His direction if we're going to pull this thing off. The theological answer to the question of how do you keep an oath even when it hurts is you abide in the grace of God, and through that you're empowered by the grace of God to keep an oath even when it hurts. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways for me is thinking about the process. When I make an oath and then I keep it even when it hurts, one of the things that has to happen for me is I got to remember the why. Why did I make this oath? You know, that's one of the, I've talked about this a bunch of different times, but it's just very true. Most of us don't start with why. We start with how. Well, we actually start with what, and then we jump right to how. Well, the how is important, but when it gets really difficult, you better have a why. You better be able to call back to, this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm making the effort. This is why it is worth the effort. This is why it's worth me keeping my oath even when it hurts. A great question for every follower of Jesus, every person, every enterprise is why? Why? I mean, that's, the 3-year-old's question. Why? And you'll almost never satisfy a 3-year-old who asks that question. But for us, we're not 3 anymore. Why matters. Why did I make the oath? Why would I keep the oath? Why? So I'm going to ask the question. And I don't know whether you've made an oath that's now getting hard to keep because it's starting to hurt. Don't know, but I do know the question's still valid. What's your why? It's worth wrestling with in partnership with Christ, because His grace is the only thing, really, that I can partner with that will bring about keeping the oath even when it hurts. Okay, I'll see you next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.